All right, so today we're talking about how we continue onwards from a start with hexagons, rhombi, then triangles on the outside. So we have a variety of these starts in Advent of Tess, and there's some similarities, some differences between these. These five can be repeated in a denser symmetry that I'm going to show today, but this one cannot because the triangle is not in a position of threefold rotational symmetry. So the way that I generated these is being able to have a triangle that could be a position of threefold rotational symmetry, like you see with this tessellation. So there's three groups around each triangle with this tessellation as well, with this one, and with this one. So always three around each triangle with the densest symmetry. But what I'm going to show today is a less dense symmetry where we can have an easier time getting our repeats without getting hung up in the tiling breaks, the pseudo tiling breaks, and everything else. So for lens stars, that gets us to lens garden. And so I've got this structure going up out of the top of a cluster, and that same structure going down out of the bottom. And so if I think of matching these pleats with these pleats, we get an exact copy of our center spread out, and we can space that as far out as we want. It's like we had a bunch of these as modular pieces, and then we were slotting them together, so we can slide that tighter or keep it further out. And there's more that we can do with this tiling than the previous one. Like I had mentioned, tight flowers. This one can only be repeated in the tiling that I'm explaining today, the expansion of the hex-rom tri-rom tiling. Another one that's very similar to tight flowers is tatted buds. So where tight flowers is the rhombus instead of open triangle, that you'll see the open triangle stars today and tomorrow. Then tight flower is the open rhombus version. Tatted buds is the closed rhombus version of the closed triangle stars that we saw yesterday and the day before. And of course we can do this with the other tessellations with open rhombi. We can do this with other tessellations as well. And this one, I've taken a tessellation that would repeat in the denser symmetry if I used closed triangles, and done it with open triangles. And I was considering teaching a version of this today where we bring the spacing in even closer, but I decided to go with lens garden instead because this technique is particularly helpful when you are working with open hexagon twists. So let's look a little bit at the theory before we continue with the practice. So I'm going to bring us over to the tiling diagram, and apparently my mouse is not very happy with me right now, so I'm going to be using my trackpad. And we've got this structure, the hexagon with the rhombi touching it. That's important because the pleat goes directly from the hexagon to the rhombus, and then over to the triangles at the pleat overlaps of the rhombi. And what's key here is that if we go to look at the boundaries, we don't get very far before we have to cut through shapes to get a closed hexagon boundary with no bumps and wiggles. So that's really what we're looking at. We've got a loop, actually exactly like I've been teaching, of around the hexagon we have these alternating rhombi and triangles that fits well and has all its pleats going out nicely. And then every loop after that is going to have some twist that it cuts through. We're not going to have a true tiling break ever after, which is part of why I folded these tessellations that are aligned with the repeats all the way out to the edge, because I was not aligning with a tiling break when I did so. Then this one, Len's Garden, I was able to do a little modification at the border, so I still get a slight border, but again, it's not at a tiling break, and so there are modifications that had to be made. And let's take a quick look at the symmetries here. So if we bring up the maximum symmetry available on this tiling, and let's zoom in. Let's do, okay. Let's do, okay, come on, outside of that menu, there we go. And we can see that the hexagon is still a position of six-fold rotational symmetry, just like it is in the densest symmetry possible. By the way, in the densest symmetry possible, we would have a rotationally symmetric point in the center of each twist, where we would have six-fold, two-fold in the rhombus, and three-fold in the triangle. But here we're spacing those out, and so the two-fold position is between 4 twists, 2 rhombi and 2 triangles that we see, like this one, for example. And so that's in the middle of this bar that extends between clusters. And then our threefold position is in the middle of this loop of 6, which is alternating rhombus, triangle, rhombus, triangle, rhombus, triangle. So the threefold position is basically in that same loop of 6 that we saw last week with the hex tri rhomb tri tiling. We just have different things around it. The hexagon connects differently to the rhombus instead of to the triangle, and it's overall a broader structure that we're dealing with. So let's return to folding, and I'll make sure I can see if there's any questions. And okay, great. So what we're going to do now is grab a 48-fold grid, and it's a good idea if, if you're watching this live, it's a good idea to watch first and then fold along later, because often there will be like one step that you miss, and then it's frustrating if you're trying to follow along live. So I'm going to choose, so you can see I have a side with harsher grid lines and a side with smoother grid lines. I'm going to start on the side with smoother grid lines because with Len's Garden, Len's Stars becomes Len's Garden in this tiling. I have my open hexagon on what I call the back. If you don't care about which side is front and which side is back, then this distinction doesn't matter. But let's go ahead and put a open hexagon on the back, which means my mountain is coming one spacing above my right side corner for the right-handed twist. And this is true of any grid, like any number of grid divisions, as long as your grid is aligned with the edge of the paper. This technique will work for finding the center and centering your open hexagon on it. So if you've been watching my Advent of Tess videos, you know that all of our hexagons we start by referencing to the corner. It's just a lot easier to find all the pleats if you're not worrying about, oh, am I actually centered or no? This removes all doubt. And once we've got that hexagon star puff, I'm going to smooth out, make sure all of my mountains and valleys of my pleats are firmly in place before I press from the top to squash. And then use my bone folder to squish it the rest of the way. And I'm also using my bone folder to firm up my pleats going to the outside. This is more of a personal preference thing, but I don't like my twists being loosely in place. I like them to be very firmly in place so they don't want to come out later. Next, I'll flip my paper over, and I'm not really paying attention to how I flip it because I know that my hexagon is in a position of six-fold rotational symmetry. It's in the center of the paper, and therefore all pleats are the same to me. Then I'm going to fold the start of lens stars. So I'm going to need a pleat that comes in, and my valley is going to hit one of these mountains coming out of the hexagon, one outside of the hexagon hole. And the direction that it hits is important. It's going to make an acute angle with the mountain coming out. So I'll grab my pens. And there's many ways to find this position. This is just the one I happened to see more readily today. Then my mountain will be coming through here. And one thing that I know from either looking at a crease pattern or looking at this finished piece is that that mountain is going to be the through line of my rhombus. So my central diamond is going to be sitting right there on top of the pleat. So I'll go ahead and bring up that valley and mountain, and notice that I'm not extending it through the pleat that I'm intersecting with, but I am extending it through the pleat down below. Once this is set up, I'm going to reach under this pleat, under the one that I'm intersecting with, and open it up until I can continue running that through line out. And here's another point of reference. My mountain should be 3 spacings away from the next pleat over. So this should be 3 spacings. And the mountain that I opened, I'm going to need to shift down a spacing in the same direction it was running before, to set up my closed rhombus twist. Once I've got it, I can go ahead and squash. And I'm going to need to propagate this all the way around. So one way to see that would be to use the same reference again to say, okay, my valley hits at a 60-degree angle, one spacing out from the corner of the hexagon hole. Therefore, my mountain is one spacing further out, and my central diamond of the rhombus is sitting right there. Then this mountain is running into this pleat on the other side of this extra wide tube, and it's running in at a 120-degree angle. Well, this strongly suggests that we're going to have a triangle twist there, and indeed we can go ahead and set up our closed triangle twist as a three-way intersection here off the tip of our rhombus, our first rhombus, and we're going to let it lay down flat as we continue setting up our new rhombus. So that we have a place to push down and squash our new rhombus, then flip the triangle out and squash that as well. So if you'd like a more thorough view of how to go about getting this first round started, check out the Advent of Tess video for lens stars. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but you'll see this guy on the thumbnail for the video. So we're going to continue around in exactly the same way. And the easy way for me to set up this reference is to say, hey, my triangle is going to be centered one spacing off of the corner of the rhombus. So that's where my mountain fold needs to go and hit the next pleat from the hexagon and continue through because it's a through line, and set up the next rhombus and put that triangle in as a three-way intersection for now that I will squash as soon as my rhombus is squashed. This is the other reason to fold from the recording, because once we have a technique, we're going to repeat it multiple times, and I will generally fold faster in the repeats than I do the first time through. And I'll check again for any questions. Don't see any. Okay. I would be able to see all of the comments, but all at once, but I didn't set up soon enough, and so that screen is hidden behind the screen that lets me see what I'm doing with my hands. Okay. So we've got another set. We're going to go around, do the same thing again. This time we have a pleat over here on the far side of the pleat we're opening for the rhombus, and that we're going to make a pleat overlap with as well. So it's not going to give the same width 3 pleats all the way out. We're going to have some overlaps in there to deal with. Oh, and if you're wondering what paper I'm using to get these nice, crisp, crinkly noises, it's Skytone from Mohawk. It's fantastic paper for tessellations. So now we're around to the 6th pleat from the hexagon, our 6th and final rhombus, and our final 2 triangles. Because just like we saw even with the hexagon triangle rhombus triangle tiling, whatever we do with the twist nearest the hexagon once in the beginning, and then we have a pair of things after, So then we need the extra thing paired with the first one when we get around to the end. So what I'm going to do is open up, and there's an order to these pleats. This one went in first, then this one from the rhombus, then this one from our latest rhombus. And we need to open things up in the opposite order. And as I'm opening things up, I'm also prepping my triangle. Then popping open on the far side, and you'll notice because I prepped my triangle, I have a ridge going straight to where the triangle needs to be on the other side. And then it's a matter of finding where my rhombus is. And that I can do either by reference to things I've folded already, or having the rhombus like pop out and tell me, or saying, okay, my through line went through, my diagonal needs to jump over a spacing. And here, having the triangle down as a three-way intersection isn't actually helping. So I'm going to squash the rhombus and just be careful to push all the way out into that corner. Then squash one triangle and then the other. And now that I'm here, I'm at a tiling break, and I'm going to smooth out all of my pleats. First, making sure that all of my mountains and valleys are actually on grid lines, because we don't want to set a mistaken pleat into place any harder than it already is. And so now I'm back in the situation where all of my pleats are equal. Everything is acting the same, and I want to put more repeats of this in. And I'm going to get one ring of repeats, so 6 sets of this, one on each branch, so to speak. And I was looking at the crease pattern earlier and seeing, okay, usually when I fold this, I would do it as dense as possible without overlaps. So I would have a tube in here. But if I'm on a 48 fold grid and I'm just doing one loop of repeats out, I can do an extra spacing and still get a good amount of grid at the edges. So that's what I'm going to do today. Instead of having my next valley 2 spacings out from the current valley, I'm going to go 1 more spacing. I'm going to do a quick check for questions. Don't see any. And so when we're doing this, whenever we have a valley, we're going to have a mountain next to it. Even though it doesn't look like we have a mountain going straight here, we actually do, and it goes from the center of the triangle into the rhombus. This is where this line is going to end up. So which side do we put the triangle on and which side the rhombus? Well, like we saw earlier in the tiling diagram, our rhombus and triangle are alternating around this loop of 4. So the pleat that is coming from a rhombus has to go to a triangle, which is good because this is the only pleat that has that 120-degree intersection that we need to form a triangle. And right now I'm creating a pleat overlap where the rhombus is going to go, just so we can get things firmed up before we really nail things into place. So I'll squash my triangle, then open my pleat overlap, shift my mountains where they need to go for the rhombus. Remember that the through line of the rhombus comes from the triangle. in this tessellation. And voila, I have 2 new twists equivalent to these two. Just like I said, that mountain goes from the center of the triangle to the corner and then in through the center of the rhombus. And we're going to move to our next set of parallel pleats and set up our next twists. We're going to start in the same way by putting our valley here, 3 spacings out. And you might be wondering, can I change that spacing in different places in the pattern? And no, this is a one single variable here, at least in each direction of grid at a minimum. We're going to have the same spacing between each of these clusters so that we can complete the triangle of clusters. So starting out with this, we're going to put in, and I'm going to choose to do both the triangle and the rhombus because I would rather not open that pleat overlap. And I know already that my rhombus through line is off of the triangle, and I can lay that triangle down as a 3-way intersection to squash the rhombus, then bring up the triangle and get those squashed in place. Now, I have a pleat overlap, and I want to deal with that now so that I can know exactly what I need to do moving forward. So what I am seeing here is that I've got triangle rhombus, just like this triangle rhombus. So I know that the next thing off of this pleat needs to be a triangle. I also know that because the through lines of the rhombi only go to triangles. And I know it needs to be centered 1 spacing out from the rhombus, from the corner of the rhombus. And here it's heading off to a pleat from a triangle, which you would think goes to a rhombus. But because we're in the hex-rom, tri-rom expanded tiling, I'm actually going to lay that down as a 3-way intersection to put the rhombus in later. And so I'll get 1 triangle here and a setup for something later, the 3-way intersection that's going to lead to other things. So if I don't want to keep track specifically of, oh, I need this spacing and that spacing and the other spacing, what I can do, well, okay. So now that I've set the spacing, that's pretty well set. I think I'm going to continue working from this pair of pleats and then grab the overlap after. You see, I don't have a fixed way of folding these tessellations. It's all ad hoc. So I'm going to continue with that 3 spacing, put in the triangle and the rhombus, squash the rhombus, squash the triangle, flatten them both very thoroughly, and then at this overlap, I'm going to need a triangle and a 3-way intersection that will set up the next rhombus. So setting up my triangle here, setting up the 3-way intersection that you might want to squash into a triangle, but hold off, let it stay as a three-way intersection, because it's going to become a rhombus soon. And I'll work my way around, all the way around my tessellation, doing exactly the same thing. Again, that's why the recording is so helpful. And I'm getting my triangle and my rhombus set up, squashing first the rhombus and then the triangle, then resolving my pleat overlap with a triangle that's directly connected to the rhombus, and a three-way intersection to prep for the next rhombus directly connected to the triangle. And yes, tessellations do require a lot of patience because we're going to be doing this many times. But I love it. I fold to relax, not to like experience new things every second. So this is very much what I want in a hobby. Of course, the flip side of that is I generally don't fold the same tessellation twice, unless I'm teaching. And so I'll usually be experiencing new things, solving new problems each time. So here again, so we're around to the sixth side. Again, I have these pair of pleats that I know my distance out on. And I'm going to start with those and cause pleat overlaps on either side, even though usually I would say to start from one side of a set of parallel pleats and work your way to the other. Here we're starting in the middle of a set of parallel pleats and working to the outside. And before I open that overlap, I'm going to check again for questions. Okay. And so we're finishing up folding all the way around the outside of the first one, and we're going to end up with this triangle, rhombus, triangle with a setup for the next rhombus on each of our 6 directions away from the center. So we're not folding whole clusters at a time. We're going out bit by bit and getting things set up little by little. Next up, starting a new ring, I'm going to pick a set of parallel pleats, pick a side to start from. So I'm going to start with the thing that's already half set up and set it up the rest of the way. And when I'm setting up this rhombus, one of the things that I'm aware of, because I've folded this kind of tessellation before, is that I won't get the whole hexagon on this loop around. I need to set up half of the hexagon, but not the whole thing, which is a lot harder with an open hexagon than with a closed hexagon. So how do we do that? Well, we layer a compound wrap, what I've seen people calling a zigzag wrap, with a triangle wrap. So here my rhombus is setting up, it's coming in to this neighboring mountain fold at a 60-degree angle. And so if I overshoot the overlying pleat one spacing, then zigzag back, I end up with that compound wrap, and I can go ahead, squash my rhombus. Then when I go around to put the next rhombus on top, I'm going to have a valley fold that runs through here all the way down to here. I already have a valley going this way, so I'll need another valley going out in the third direction, and I'll need an intersection of mountains above it so I can set up my next rhombus. And this pleat is going to go all the way up and through the existing pleats above. And I can go ahead and squash that rhombus. Then move on to the next set of parallel pleats, where I will have my rhombus that I'm setting up, and also, this time, a triangle. So the rhombi and the triangles, they really come in pairs. Now, another way to think about setting up the compound wrap is to go ahead and fold a pleat overlap. I'm going to go ahead and squash these two twists. Then the pleat overlap actually gives you, oh, sorry, if the pleat overlap was the other way around, it would give you good information about where the mountains are with the wrap. But in this case, I'm going to need to know that I have one spacing of overhang. Then I set up my two three-way intersections of mountains, and then I can lay everything down flat. Next up, I'm going to put the rhombus on top again. And one thing that we're going for here is 3 pleats in an accordion on top of each other. Right now I have 1, and I'm going to end up, if I pop this valley down, then I end up adding a pleat to the accordion for the wrap, for the triangle wrap, and then adding a third for the rhombus itself. So this is not the easiest of ways to explore this tiling, but it is one of the prettiest. And so I figured, since last week I explored one of the easiest ways to do that tiling, this week I would explore one of the harder ways to have these partial hexagons. And also because, like, everyone was wanting to know how to repeat this further out. This move will also help you if you're repeating it at maximum density. So if you are doing this, that move will also help. and checking in for questions. Okay. So now we have the same setup that we came into this area with, and we're going to do the same thing in response. We're going to set up the rhombus that had been preset, which will give us the line to set up a triangle that will erase the overlap that was running all the way through all of the pleats, and we can set up our compound wrap either now or after we squash the twists. Squash our rhombus and triangle. And I should mention, if at any point in any round you forget to squash a triangle, it's not going to cause any issues. Just squash it when you see it. Then for our next rhombus in here, we're going to add a triangle wrap on top of our compound wrap and cause a pleat to go through all of the pleats in the next direction. And squash. And from here, I'm going to speed up a bit because we've seen this repeated a couple times now. I'm going to set up my rhombus and my triangle, making sure everything actually is on grid spacings. Set up my compound wrap, squash that down, squash the triangle, and you can start seeing how this way of folding is actually much more accessible than trying to pre-crease everything and collapse all at once, or to fold an entire cluster at the same time. So we get nice stopping points along the way. And we also have like lots of achievement at all points. We're always folding twists, which set up pleat overlaps, which we resolve with more twists. And so we have our local resolutions of things and then our global resolutions of things, and they all feed into each other. And eventually we make our way all the way around, and then we have a slightly different set of operations, but all in service of the same tiling. Same tiling, same tessellation. And so we're getting around to our final set of repeats. And here again, I'm going to use the compound wrap in here. And then when I set up my last rhombus of this ring around, so the rhombus in here, you see it looks a little bit different than we're used to. We already have a pleat here. So I'm setting up this rhombus, and as I do that, I'm also going to open the pleat above for the next triangle. So getting my full accordion in here, and squash, squash the triangle, and that is a full loop around. So zooming out a bit, you can see all of my 6 sides are exactly identical. And so when I'm folding these many repeats, I'm not doing one twist in one place and then immediately repeating that twist in the other 5 places that are identical. I'm starting in one place and working my way all the way around, eventually doing everything the same. But it's not piecemeal, it's very systematic. So that's how I think about things. When you're right in the center, it can look very piecemeal, but you really want to move smoothly around to minimize pleat overlaps as you go. So checking for questions. All right. Now I'm going to start the next loop where I will finish my hexagons, but I still won't have full repeats around, I still won't have full repeats of the center, because I'm going to just finish the hexagon, not finish the hexagon and the next rhombus. So there will be more twists as well as the hexagon, which we will see very soon. So opening this up, I've got these 3-way intersections that I need to open enough that the pleats that come in from the rhombi are pointing in, and you can start seeing these are making an open hexagon star. So let me mark the points of this star. And we're doing the hexagon first because it's the thing that's most set up. And so we're going to keep adding pleats around our hexagon until it's ready. Everything is smooth and flat, and we can squash it down. Once we're there, we can flip over and we have some pleat overlaps to resolve. First and foremost, this one right here is an unfriendly overlap that we're going to resolve into a full rhombus twist. And then we have another pleat overlap out here that we will resolve into a triangle and a partial rhombus. So we're not going to put the full rhombus right now because that would commit us to another layer of twists before we get to a pseudo break. So we're just going to put in the triangle and then lay this 3-way intersection on top. And we're going to go around and do that for each set of parallel pleats, aka each cluster. And one way that I like to look at this is to say, well, is there anything more that I could set up from this side? Can I avoid that unfriendly overlap? And yes, actually I can. If I set up this rhombus that we saw comes in below the hexagon, if I set that up first, and the way I'm going to do this so I can squash the hexagon flat is set this up as a compound wrap. So I'm taking the point of the rhombus. So I've got my rhombus, and I'm taking this point right here, opening up just enough to pop it down while keeping the other mountains in place. And I can lay that down, then flip over and I have yet another pleat telling me exactly where this hexagon star needs to go. So it's very hard to miss the hexagon stars when they have 4 pleats telling you where they are. Flipping over, I'll open up that compound wrap that the rhombus was set up as, and I'll also open up this pleat overlap, which again is going to be a triangle and a rhombus prep. So they look the same, but one of them is on a pleat coming from a rhombus and the other is on a pleat coming from a triangle. And so we know to lay that 3-way intersection down flat and wait for it to become a rhombus later. Now we have another pleat overlap in here, and these are going to become a new rhombus triangle pair. And we can use several things to set this up. The first is that we're going to need to have our pleat run across. And the second is we have this spacing of 1 more than tube. This is the same 3 spaces that we measured out from the center. And so we're going to have another triangle, again, because it's coming from the pleat that has a rhombus, and 3-way intersection that is not, that will become a rhombus that's set up and laid down. So another way that I can tell I've done this right is that the corner of all 3 of these triangles is interacting with this open space in exactly the same way. And that's important because our position of 3-fold rotational symmetry is in the middle of there. So then coming around, and there's other ways that you could resolve this. Like I could have said, oh, we're going to not put that triangle at all and have this be a border element and just have it sit like that. Then we would have, I think, actually, that's going to be like a very good way to finish this one. It's very similar to how I finished this bigger one, but this time I actually have enough space between the clusters that it can stay that way. So whichever way you want to do it on yours, you could spread and fill out the whole thing, or you could have more of a border effect. Either way. I do know that the mountain folds coming in here are going to come in here and here. So they're not going to cause any new interaction there. So whatever you want to do with that intersection is perfectly fine. Continuing around, I've got my next set of parallel pleats, and I will pause and check for questions. All good. We're going to do exactly the same thing again, where I will set up this rhombus and then pop this corner down as a compound wrap. And you know you have it in the right place where it's outlining this hexagon hole. And then flipping over, I can open up by poking from the back side the rest of my hexagon. And I'll just need to add 2 more pleats to get that firmly in place. And squash. So the reason why I'm setting up this rhombus as the compound wrap instead of just putting in the rhombus twist is so I have a flat space to squash both the hexagon and the rhombus. So we've got this triangle wrap, or sorry, this pleat overlap in here that will be a triangle and a three-way intersection that will eventually become a rhombus. And then we have this overlap at the edge, which I'm going to choose to have a mountain run between two three-way intersections, two spacings between two three-way intersections, and let that be a border element. Coming around, same thing on the next cluster, where I'm setting up my rhombus as a compound wrap from this side. So yeah, every move you do, it's useful to be able to also do it from the other side. So here I'm going to demonstrate what this looks like if I just go ahead and set up my hexagon from this side. I'm going to have the out here, the over here. And so this is a skill that comes with a lot of practice. As one of my students would say, yes, this is me showing off. But what's the fun if you can't show off every once in a while? And so you can set up the twists really any way you like, as long as they actually get set up and actually get squashed. Some ways are easier than others. And I mean, there's always pre-creasing if you need it. But I tend to avoid the pre-creasing like the plague, because it's just so much easier to do things this way, where I know that things will work out, even if I'm doing things that other people would probably say are insane, like what I'm going to show you at the very end, another alternative option for continuing with this kind of start. And there's just so many different ways to do things, so many different tessellations to fold. So my view on pre-creasing is, why would I take the time to pre-crease if I can do it another way and it's really satisfying and I'm going to be folding the grid either way? So that's my opinion. And getting this down and in. One of the things that I do see people gravitate towards pre-creasing for is people tend to think that there's like not that many or not that interesting of patterns that can be folded without pre-creasing. And that's just not true. There's so many patterns that can be folded without pre-creasing. I've designed about 300, and I know that there are many more like adjacent to my designs, but slightly different, that you can do without any need of pre-creasing. And just like this one, they come out really gorgeous. So if you're thinking that only simple designs don't need pre-creasing, consider again. And here you can see I've got all 6 of my outer hexagons, I do have some pleat overlaps yet. Got this rhombus to put in. And the pleat overlap that I've been dealing with on this side. And that little border element. Then I've got just the border element to put in on the other side to finish my loop around the center. Okay, so we had the central hexagon, the loop around the central hexagon that set up the repeating motif, the loop that determined the spacing, the next loop that set up more rhombi and set up those like wraps on wraps with the triple accordion. And then this loop, we resolved that triple accordion into the open hexagon twist. And finally, this next loop, we will finish the repeats. So I'm going to grab a set of parallel pleats and treat it just like I did the central cluster. So I'll start over here and set up my triangle and rhombus. And you can see my mountain is exactly where I thought it would be. There. Squash my rhombus, squash my triangle. And because I did 3 spaces in the middle instead of 2, I have a nice cleaner border setup. Whereas if I had only had 2 spacings, I would be starting the next cluster in here. Then up here, I'm going to do a triangle, and the rhombus is already half set up, so I'm just going to have the triangle below. Get that squished in place. And that completes the cluster. And I will move on to another cluster. If I was folding another repeat in here, it would matter more to me what order I do these in. But as it stands, each cluster is not interacting with any other cluster. And since I'm at the edge of the grid like this, I'm going to just do each cluster as its own thing. It doesn't make a difference at this point whether I do the clusters in order around the center or not. So I'll get my triangle and rhombus just like we did around the center. Then the next triangle and rhombus is actually even easier than around the center because my rhombus is half set up already. And squash that. Then continue doing exactly the same thing, where I'm going to have my triangle and my rhombus. And you might notice sometimes the rhombus wants to look like this, but that's a crow's foot pattern instead of a X. And our rhombi need to make X's because they need to be twofold rotationally symmetric in and of themselves, regardless of whether they're in a actual twofold position in the pattern as a whole. And I'm going to work my way around doing the same thing another 3 times. So I get my triangle and rhombus, just like in the center. So the reason why I work around in these loops is so we're not trying to do like 10 million twists at once. We're just doing 2, maybe 3 at a time. Usually just 1 though, so that we can get everything in, find a flat state, and be able to squash on the desk instead of in the air, and just generally get nice, precise things out of it. And coming around, I think this is one of fairly few times in my live streams where I'm actually like teaching a concept with an actual project that turns out to look pretty in the end instead of just being a practice piece. So there's a draw for this particular video, because mostly I'm focused on building skills, but with the tilings, like I teach in tessellations by tiles, it tends to be more about, okay, how do we fold this with more repeats? How do we do that in a way that ensures that we still get something that looks pretty? And so I'd say we've definitely achieved that here today. And so I see a question in the chat. Paper and grid size. I'm using a 48 fold grid on Skytone. I started with a hexagon, and I can actually grab one. My starting size was fairly large. It's one of the larger hexagons that you can cut from a 12.5-inch wide rectangle. So that's the paper I'm using. And yeah, we've got a beautiful result. And I want to show you one more way to repeat these clusters that I'm teaching in Advent of Tess, which is, well, how do you repeat this one? You can repeat it with the densest symmetry and get just rhombi. You can repeat it with a symmetry further out, and I don't have the example of that right on hand, and get some interesting shapes. Or you can treat this whole cluster like a hexagon twist and add big triangles on those double depth pleats. Now this is more difficult to collapse because you have to collapse a group of 6 rhombi and its hexagon all at once, but it produces some fantastic results, and I don't know, this tessellation is just fabulous, and it's very close to being aligned with a triangle grid where the grid lines are aligned with the edge. So there's just so many ways, and any of these clusters, to be honest, can do this as long as you manage the pleats. So when you have pleats coming out in tubes, you would need something that acts like a triangle on a tube pleat. When you have pleats coming out like this, you would need something that acts like a triangle with 2 pleats like that. There's just a lot of variations with these ways of starting a tessellation. And so this is why I say that tessellations are really limitless. We have so many different ways of combining twists, and then once we have like a central structure, which we can experiment with by hand, then we can put it into all kinds of other structures as well. So that was the hex-rom, tri-rom expanded tiling, and it's a very similar process. If you're folding the densest possible symmetries, you want to be careful to use each pleat once as you go around. And if you were to join me inside of tessellations by tiles, I have a full lecture on that tiling as well, although registration for that is not currently open and probably won't be for a few months, depending on when you're listening to this. So this is Len's Garden, built from Lens stars. I hope you enjoy folding it, either as Lens stars or Len's Garden, and I'd be curious to see what you fold. Tag me at Gathering Folds on Instagram or Facebook, and yeah, it's super exciting to see what everyone's folding for Advent of Tess. I'm just blown away by the response to that. Like, there's been over 500 posts with hashtag Advent of Tess, which is just fabulous, seeing everyone dipping their toes into tessellations or coming back to tessellations after some time away, or doing a different kind of tessellation that they don't usually do. So this is all very exciting, and I will see you all next time. And I'm taking a break next week for Christmas, so there's just so many things to fold. I hope you have a great holiday season, and I will see you back on this channel in the new year. And I'm seeing lots of comments on closed triangle linked flowers. I've seen 2 repeats of closed triangle linked flowers. It's amazing. This actually is something that I hadn't folded myself. I just proposed this for everyone else to do, and y'all are taking me up on it, which is very exciting. So there's so many things to fold, and I hope y'all have fun exploring them. I will see y'all later. Happy folding, and have fun.